I remember that now.
I'm gonna unmask to introduce.
Okay.
I'll put it back on, but I'm way over here. Are we good, Will? All right. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. Doctorate from the University of Missouri with an emphasis manuscript, The Predicament of Crossing, the Black Collegian and the Popular Imagination. Signifying Sisters, Black Women's Humor and Intersectional Poetics is forthcoming in the journal Meridians. Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism, and Keeping the Civil Rights Movement Alive, Black Spring Break is forthcoming in Mississippi Folklife magazine. Dr. Bailey will provide instructions for the panelists, and I just want to thank you again for joining us. I think this is going to be a great discussion. Thank you.
All right. Good evening. Thank you so much for this invitation. So before I give brief opening remarks, I just wanted to briefly introduce our panelists, who are some, if I must say so myself, some outstanding graduate students and doctoral candidates at the University of Arkansas. So to my immediate left is Leah Beth Lewis. Her pronouns are she and her. She's a PhD candidate at the U of A in the Department of English, and she specializes in rhetoric and composition. Her research focuses on composition pedagogy and administration rooted in womanist theory, as well as her current project is Southern Film Archetypes in First-Year Composition, Care, Labor, and Collective Institutional Memory in the Hospitality State. Lewis lives in Fayetteville with her wife. To her left is Samir Mayes. He is a doctoral candidate, also at the U of A. His major is comparative literature and cultural studies, and his research interests include Arabic literature, African American studies, and post-colonial theory. He will briefly talk about political censorship, why and how it operates in Jordan. And then lastly, to the far left, to my far left, is Anthony Sargenti. He's an instructor of Italian. He's also a PhD candidate in comparative literature and cultural studies at the U of A. His research involves contemporary Italian hip hop and post-colonial Italian identities. And he has an amazing dissertation director.
Yes, I do.
Yes. No, all jokes aside. So thank you all so much for those of you who are watching, for joining us on this occasion during Banned Books Week. And so our panelists will talk briefly, 5 to 10 minutes, on the topic of censorship as it pertains to their research, or really, whatever aspect of censorship they're interested in. But before we go into their individual presentations, I just wanted to briefly talk about Toni Morrison, whose works often appear on banned books lists. And I wanted to share, there's a site called Toni Morrison, Patron Saint of Banned Books and Their Readers. And this particular piece was shared on August the 8th, 2019, not long after Morrison's death. And I'm not going to read in its entirety, but I just thought there were a couple interesting points that I thought were worth noting and to kind of help frame our discussion this evening. So the writer says, Morrison's books frequently appeared on the American Library Association's annual list of most frequently challenged and banned books. And they note that CBLDF, which is the abbreviation for the organization, often wrote about challenges to the bluest eye, beloved, and fought to get these critical texts back in the classroom and libraries where they belong. The Washington Post then wrote a response piece looking at comments on social media about how Morrison's works changed people's lives, and it is a wonderful reminder of why keeping access to these texts is crucial. I often teach Morrison in my classes, and so her works are extremely, extremely important for understanding so many social issues and the historic context that accompanies those issues. Morrison spoke eloquently about censorship and often defended other writers' works that were under fire. Famously, she talked about how the first time she read Huckleberry Finn, it incited within her a muffled rage, but as an adult, she came to appreciate its merits. She then went on to say, the brilliance of Huck Finn is that it is the argument it raises. I think that quote might have a typo. She also mentioned that calls to ban the book were, quote, a purist yet elementary kind of censorship designed to appease adults rather than educate children, end quote. An observation which somehow encapsulates censorship in schools and libraries on a whole. And then 10 years later, or 10 years ago, which at this point would be about 12 years ago, Morrison wrote that, quote, the thought that leads me to contemplate with dread the erasure of other voices, of unwritten novels, poems, whispered or swallowed out loud languages flourishing underground, essayist questions challenging authority never being posed, unstaged plays, canceled films, that thought is a nightmare, as though a whole universe is being described in invisible ink. Certain kinds of trauma visited on peoples are so deep, so cruel, that unlike money, unlike vengeance, even unlike justice or rights or the goodwill of others, only writers can translate such trauma and turn sorrow into meaning, sharpening the moral imagination. So it's with that thought that I want to just kind of open it up to our panelists to talk more and to elucidate more about why censorship is such an important, or rather not being censored, is so important for writers. Yeah, I will.
I think so. We'll see. And thank you everyone who is present on our live stream and for our wonderful audience here. So I would, just to kind of continue from Dr. Bailey's statements, I would say that censorship is something we could be here all night talking about, because any debate or any, I guess, conversation, really anything you hear about censorship, there's never really an end. There's never a solution. And so I think part of the reason for this is that if we're pro-censorship, it really depends on who's in power for that to be something that is positive for a country or weren't published, or maybe things that people couldn't say, for example. Ultimately, until we have an entirely different infrastructure that we're working within, it's very dangerous to censor, because always the people who have the most power are going to determine what should be censored. So at least speaking from a US perspective, as it currently stands, that just wouldn't work, because ultimately the people who are in power do not have the best interest in mind of those whose work shouldn't be banned and who do end up on banned book lists often. And so I speak to censorship from primarily a pedagogical standpoint. As Dr. Bailey mentioned, my emphasis is in first-year composition. So for those of you that may be unfamiliar, that's the English 101 and 102 classes that most students have to take at universities. And I've had the privilege of always teaching at public universities. And so censorship debates and concerns have largely been out of my frame of concern. Most of the time, I've been able to, I would say almost all of the time, I've been able to teach whatever I wanted, include whatever text I wanted. Is the case. However, with the recent bans that we've seen on critical race theory in public lower education institutions, we can now see that there is a concern and that there is probably a precedent for public universities to have their materials censored as well, and to have teachers be in danger of job losses if they, even at the higher education level, teach things that state mandates have prohibited. And so I think that it really wasn't until the rise of critical race theory censorship that I realized, oh, these are public schools that this is happening in. And so if this can happen on a lower education level, there's no one reason that it could not then trickle up, as you might say, to higher education. So that's where my concern for it stems from, or my immediate concerns. And I think that as far as classroom and curriculum censorship, I think that teachers should not be censored. However, I think it's a good idea for teachers to censor themselves, because it's always good to consider why you're bringing something into the classroom. And if one's goal is to be perceived as radical, or to be shocking, or educate your students about anything other than the subject at hand that you've been assigned to teach, I think that becomes a problem, because ultimately the most marginalized students in your class are going to suffer because of that. So particularly all of us coming from a PWI, which is a primarily white institution, something I try to caution the TAs I'm training about is, don't bring something in, especially from the positionality of a white person, don't bring something in simply to educate your white students, because ultimately you may be doing harm to the few students of color you do have at a PWI. So I think that personal censorship is a different conversation than statewide censorship. And I think that those conversations can go hand in hand, but ultimately the most pressing concern for me as an educator and as someone who wants to continue in first-year composition is the idea that public universities are now being censored in ways that could, or at least public lower education is being censored in ways that could ultimately affect the public university, which I have always intentionally taught at. And so, because I don't want to be censored. So with that in mind, I think it'd be great to hear from Samer and Anthony, because they both have very specific subject examples that they can give us, whereas mine is more from a pedagogical standpoint and just sort of the overarching idea of the educational institution. So I'll just turn it over to Samer.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. Thank you, Leah. Beth. It's really interesting. Thanks for our audience and for those who are watching us live or listening. So I would like to briefly talk about the most popular type of censorship in my home country. So I'm originally from Jordan, a country in the Middle East, not Jordan, Arkansas. Jordan is a constitutional monarchy ruled by a king and a queen. The Kingdom of Jordan, like many countries, bans lots of books, TV programs, video clips, etc., for many reasons, including blasphemy, sexuality, and violence. However, many publications mainly get banned for political reasons. And that is what I want to highlight here, as this might be also a good exercise to see another perspective of why and how political censorship operates in another country. The Jordanian government censors everything and bans any publication that says anything negative about the royal family and the ruling system in general, but not the government, which is interesting. So the freedom of thought and speech has a limit in Jordan, unfortunately. I previously wrote a term paper for one of my classes, and the title for that paper was Popular Culture in Third World Countries, the Production of Hegemonic and Counter-Hegemonic Discourses in Jordan. In that research, I elaborated on the idea of what Antonio Gramsci calls cultural hegemony by looking at how popular songs in Jordan are produced, circulated, and used to maintain cultural and political power over Jordanian citizens. A meeting with the course professor, he asked me, "You wrote an excellent paper last semester. I think you should get it published." I said, "I can't." He asked why. I said, "Because I'll be blacklisted, arrested, or maybe charged for saying something I am not supposed to, which means possibly getting myself banned from leaving or entering the country." To avoid going to jail, what many Jordanians, I observe, started to do to continue to speak about the corruption is resorting to using a metaphorical language. That is, producing counter-hegemonic discourses that allow them to say all what they want to say about the corruption and exploitation of the ruling class, but without getting themselves interrogated or incarcerated. I examined how cultural hegemonic messages and ideologies get inserted and disseminated in popular songs, and how encoded messages become part of a consumed popular culture. My understanding is that the government does this form of censorship to prevent any counter-hegemonic discourses from arising, gaining ground, and getting popular among people. So it is a matter of whose discourse is more dominant and how to make a certain meaning last longer. That is, cultural hegemony is everywhere and is a never-ending process. And that's why political censorship exists and is ubiquitous in Jordan. Language itself becomes the means for that battle, so to speak. Fortunately, Arabic language makes it easier where people can play with words. For example, a political satirist named Ahmed Hassan al-Zabi directly and constantly speaks out against one of his most famous shows is what he names Mansaf Baladi, which literally translates to local mansaf. And mansaf is the name of the most popular dish in Jordan. However, manipulating the way he says Mansaf Baladi allows him to openly speak out without fear about leaders' corruption. That is, Mansaf Baladi becomes Mansaffa Baladi, which the meaning drastically changes to who destroys my country, which obviously refers to the ruling class. Baladi in Arabic can either be an adjective meaning local or a noun meaning my country, which that's how he plays in using language. Statistics show that more than 104 books get banned every year in Jordan, which means 2 books get banned every week. And that's not something new. Between 1955 and 1987, for instance, the Jordanian government banned more than 1,200 books that mainly speak about politics. That is, topics that either expose how oppressive regimes work or directly speak about the corruption. I think these are big numbers for a small country. And by the way, Jordan is, as I should say, small or big as Texas. So with 10 millions, the population with refugees. So it's not really that big. Hadith al-Junud, or Soldiers' Talks, is a novel written in Arabic by a Jordanian author named Ayman Laftoum. In 2014, he wrote that novel. The government banned this novel after the release of its 2nd edition. And the author was under investigation and ended up in strife. The government banned him from entering or lecturing at any public university in Jordan. His novel mainly recounts events that took place inside a government university in 1986, where the Jordanian police and military interfered and killed 3 students and arrested hundreds. Despite the fact that the novel only recounts the events neutrally, the physical book was permanently banned, but there was no control on the electronic copies that were uploaded online or the physical copies that were sold outside Jordan from the 1st edition. This novel continues to be banned today. People in Jordan read censorship as taking away from them the right to think. I have read recently that the official authority of censorship, or as it is called, Jordan Media Monitor, is not as strict as before regarding other topics, but obviously not when it comes to politics. That is a red line, as they say there. Unfortunately, I believe that this kind of censorship will continue to exist and be exercised in Jordan simply because the regime wants to maintain power over people. I am a bit pessimistic here, but I do not see how censorship of this kind will cease there. Such a type of censorship, I think, is systematic and is part of defining the kingdom and maintaining control over people on different levels. Censorship does divide us anywhere and take away from us the right to think, to write, and to learn. I would like to end with a quotation by Henry Steele Commager, who is an American historian. He says, "The fact is that censorship always defeats its own purpose, for it creates in the end the kind of society that is incapable of exercising real discretion. In the long run, it will create a generation incapable of appreciating the difference between independence of thought and subservience. Thank you. So, Anthony, I think will share us.
Try to follow that. Yeah,
Sure.
those are both
Thank you.
excellent talks. I actually have just a few very informal slides that I'll just put up here. No, wait. So, you can have a clicker over there. We'll see if it works. Okay. So I want to thank Dr. Bailey for this. I was very humbled and honored to be asked to talk about censorship. And my first thought was that I was at a loss what the word actually meant. I had a feeling I knew what it meant, but I could not explain it into words. And so when I am at a loss, I look to etymologies and what the word censorship comes from. And it comes from the Roman censor about 2,000 or so years ago. This is just a relief sculpture that I found on Wikipedia Commons. The censor is the one in the middle, the person who has his hand on the other person's shoulder. And basically censors at this time were in charge of counting Roman citizens, mostly male Roman citizens, and then also judging whether they would be a part of the Senate or a part of the army based on their wealth. This was a very dignified position. Censors were also in charge of assessing information, judging what is appropriate, and what should be suppressed. And so they became a moral authority for the state. And I think that helped me understand censor and censorship. In the Italian context, my kind of project, the title of my dissertation is, I'm still working on, is Perché il mondo è cambiato, because the world has changed. This is a quote from a single from Tommy Cuti, who you can see, his 2018 track, Afro-Italiano, or Afro-Italian. And this line really spoke to me, and it inspired me to start writing this dissertation, because I think he characterizes, people like him in Italy is the reality and has been for generations. And sometimes it can come from the right in terms of, but sometimes he argues that the critique can come from the left. And sometimes, people like Tommy Cuti are labeled new Italians or hybrid Italians, and how that kind of language, even if it's trying to be inclusive, can deny really the history of people that have been living in and around Italy. And here we just have kind of some subheadings. My specific focus is on second generation Italian hip hop. I'm using that term interchangeably to mean both the second generation of Italian hip hop that started really in the 1980s, late 80s, and also second generation Italians, which is a very loose and contested term, which explains anyone that has lived or was born in Italy at a very young age. They may have been brought to Italy by the age of 1 or 2. And they've only known Italy their entire lives. Italy has very kind of strict and even sometimes fascist immigration and citizenship laws, or if one of your parents is not a citizen, you are not a citizen automatically. You have to wait at least 18 years, and basically after your 18th year of age, you have to prove with no doubts that you have never left the country in those 18 years. And you have to basically until the age of 18, until 19, to apply for this citizenship. It's not guaranteed, and after your 19th birthday, you are ineligible to be a citizen. And this is basically describing about 1 million or so people living in Italy today. It's prowess. It's not very respected nationally in Italy. Two major theories are Italian post-colonialism and cultural theory. I'm looking at what it means to be Italian these days. I'm looking at the history of what is often called the Italian resurgence, and what that actually meant for living people and people of color in Italy. It was very much not the romantic kind of story that is often told, both abroad and specifically in Italian institutions of education, where they gloss over the internal colonization of the Italian South. They basically racialized Sicilians as being African. And then, of course, Italy going into Eritrea, Libya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, and the racial and the gendered violence that they exacted there. There's two kind of major myths in Italy today. One is brava gente, or good, decent people, which basically is a form of whataboutism in terms of when every time somebody wants to bring up the violence, the documented violence in colonization, they will say things like, well, it wasn't bad as the British, or it wasn't bad as the French. You also have this idea of this very idyllic utopia of Italy that is often marketed, and so it's sometimes that goes against the reality of this history. And so two main, I think, terms of censorship that I have found in this research: living in Italy for generations. You have a lack of understanding that is, I think, bred in Italian education systems that don't talk openly. They have not reckoned with this past. It's often glossed over or denied or used as basically to trigger the privileged to censor this kind of talk. And the second one, which is basically kind of the authors that I'm looking at, is to censor the Italian identity. Who gets to be Italian? And generally the idea, the assumption is that you are white, you are male, you are middle class, you're Catholic, and that makes you Italian. Anything that deviates from that imaginary, from that stereotype, is automatically invalidating. Racial, gender plays a very big role. Language does as well. And so basically one of my arguments is basically showing what are these people rapping about, what are they singing about, and how do they claim their Italianness in ways that have been censored and that have been challenged in the past. And then seeing hip-hop culture as a site of resistance. What I've tried to make this even more familiar for my students that I have is, and some of you may have heard or seen about Kabilame. He is the second most popular TikToker in the world. He's often referred to as the most popular Italian TikToker. He's an example of a second-generation Italian. He was born in Senegal, moved to Italy when he was 1. He does not have citizenship. He's in his 20s. And while his videos are hilarious and genius, he often does talk about his predicament. He's basically become an international celebrity, and he cannot leave Italy because he has a Senegalese passport, and it's difficult for him to travel outside of the country. And so
offered by our three panelists, because on the one hand, we have Mr. Sargenti, who is giving censorship such that it almost has the potential, based on that definition, to have a positive, right? This idea of vetting or to give credentials to something, right? The moral authority of the state. But then he goes on to expand about the censorship of identity. We have discussions about political censorship offered up by Mr. Mayes, and then we also have a discussion of public, individual versus institutional censorship offered up by Ms. Lewis. So we have a wide range of perspectives so that we can discuss really censorship of identity, censorship of thought, and censorship of words, right? Which is, I think, typically, especially when we think about Banned Books Week, we think about censorship of words, but really we're looking at censorship from a much broader perspective. So thank you all so much for some insight for us. The only thing I would add before I open it up for questions from our audience, or from, if you all want to, if you have questions for each other, is that I would ask, where's my guy? I have notes everywhere, you all. Let's see. And I might have, let's see. Well, maybe I won't. Maybe I will table that question because it has gotten lost amidst my notes. And so, do we have any questions from the audience before I open it up to the panelists? All right. Do you all have questions about any of the information that you all presented?
Well, I just wanted to speak to Samir's comment about the sort of coded languages being used, the metaphors being used, because I think that that's something we also see parallels to here in the U.S. with marginalized identities. So when we think of how certain vernaculars and certain dialects developed, that when when it was illegal to be homosexual in the United States, and many states still do have very outdated laws against it on their books. They just haven't been changed. But there was a culture that developed its own language and even subsets of that language. So whether it was lesbians or gay men or trans folks or anything, you see these different queer linguistics developing, and sometimes it will be the same words that one may use in general conversation with a wider public audience, but they change meanings and they become different things. And a really recent example of this, for those who are Lil Nas X fans, is in his Industry Baby song that he just released. He has a line where the actual lyrics are, "I haven't lost since I began," but as a gay audience, everyone immediately took that to say, because of the way that he emphasizes the words, "I haven't lost since I've been gay." And so those who are just listening as, someone without any queer context would think, okay, he's just saying he's been successful from the beginning of his career, whereas those of us with a queer context are like, he's saying, hey, this thing that you were telling me is negative about me and will cause me to not succeed within certain genres of music is actually benefiting me. And so it just immediately brought to mind that for me when you were mentioning the term that was used for, I think it was a dish that, is very common. And so I think it's interesting to see how those coded languages do actually become linguistic histories for various groups. And I don't know if you noticed that in Jordan's languages, as far as like, are there dialects and things, if you can speak to that for various groups of people.
I mean, the dialects in Arabic, they're really a simplified, way of the formal of the language itself, Arabic. So I don't think with dialects, they can, and definitely this is, he's speaking dialects when he's in his show. So he plays with that. But I would say Arabic is really, being bilingual, I think I can speak English. At this point, I guess I can claim that.
I think you can too.
Right? So being bilingual, I think I can say that Arabic is really way, richer than English when it comes to that. So I can see how easy in Arabic people can play with words. And sometimes just the same word that has different meanings. And like the language did not develop just like literally this word has 5-6 meanings that you can use, and they have different, based on the context, you can understand it. So, and sometimes even changing the stress in a word changes the whole meaning. And like what he's doing, the spelling of the word is still the same. But instead of, this country, the meaning, significantly changes. So I'm not sure about English. Maybe I need to dig deeper, but I think English, I feel it's not as rich as.
Well, there's definitely more versions, I would think, of Arabic, just not even considering censorship or marginalities. Everyone that is speaking Arabic from different countries, they have their own versions of it, obviously. So I would think within Jordan specifically, I'm sure there's those pockets, again, it's not something we're supposed to know, because these are secret codes that protect people.
Oh yeah, this is really interesting because, this is, and they can't come and arrest them simply because, I really did not say that, I say this.
Yeah.
So they just play on them. Okay, I really did not mean that. If you took it that way, it's up to you, but that's what I said. And this is a way for them, to say whatever they want. So it gives them a kind of freedom. And I find this really interesting.
That's a really, so thank you for both that question and response, right? This idea of like this double entendre, this nuance to language that can allow a certain sense of freedom and autonomy that the government would otherwise try to stifle, right? I think was really interesting. I think the question that I was going to ask earlier for each of you, or whoever is so inclined to respond, is, so you mentioned, Samir, this idea of, because Jordan is a constitutional monarchy, right, that there's political censorship. And I guess my question for you all would be, is all censorship, let's say, although the government is not necessarily censoring writers in the same way, if we are suppressing a work because of claims of either it's too sexually explicit or it's violates that it's not Christian, and we pride ourselves for being on a nation founded on religious freedom, but it's atheist or whatever the justification is, right? If it's Little Nas X and we think this is queer as opposed to we want to uphold heteronormative values, like whatever the case is, like is there such a thing as apolitical censorship? Like does censorship exist in a political vacuum, I guess is the question I'm asking.
I think in Jordan, I would not hesitate to say yes, it is political. I mean, not just, about everything, literally, because the government is really in charge of everything. I mean, even the Friday khutbah, what we call ceremony, right? They give this, just like Sunday here,
Right, the Sabbath.
Right. So even this, the government, tells them what to speak about. So I think the government really is in charge of everything, and when it comes to religion, when it comes to, just when you think about media, like nothing, you can't really say anything without being censored. I'm not sure about Facebook. I don't know if really they have control over that. But I would say, yes, in Jordan, that's the case. I'm not sure about the US, though.
What is your experience, Anthony, with Italian censorship? I mean, is it directly related to the politics?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's still, there are still people that say, there's no such thing as a black Italian. That's an oxymoron. There are still people that say there are no gay families in Italy, which is obviously a lie, and it's really used in a much more, I think, hard to hear, at least in, kind of generally speaking. More to Dr. Bailey's question, which is fascinating, two kind of thoughts that I had in terms of this, political or not. One was just, a sociology class that I took early on. This author was describing, how the term objectivity has become very colonized, and it's been used to really mean anyone that does not have an emotional investment in any sort of topic. And if you have no emotional investment in anything at all, then you have extreme privilege. And so that basically kind of, decolonizing and being critical of the word objectivity. And also I got here a little bit early. I was walking around the library. They have a very small kind of microcosm banned books, over time, a lot of Toni Morrison's. And then they had a really fascinating thing on that same little podium. It was searches of reasons for why books were banned, and the number biggest, this word cloud, was LGBTQIA+, front and center. The next one was Black Lives Matter, and then anti-racism. And so I think for me, and maybe it's a blanket statement, it's hard to understand censorship outside of a political realm. I think even what both of you, all three of you have said, it's all about power. Who has the power to exact censorship? Who has the power to call a topic controversial? I think that term is also being used in classrooms as a way to try not to trigger the privilege. At the same time, it's hard for me, and now I'm showing my bias, to imagine humane treatment for everyone as a controversial topic. But it's come that way in this, I think, very hyper political realm, where people's health is political, when 50 years ago it wasn't that much.
So it's a struggle over meaning, like Anthony said, and this is actually what I think Antonio Gramsci really talks about. This is struggle over meaning. Whose meaning lasts longer and stays the strongest? And I think in some countries, I think that's the policies they use. I mean, once their meaning becomes weak, and the ruling class and then the ruled, once the ruled class come up with a new meaning, and disseminate it here and there, that's when the ruling class becomes really anxious. Because if their meaning becomes more powerful than theirs, that's when a civil war might happen. Just like in Syria, right now the war is really whose meaning So who's the terrorist, us or them? And I think this is a struggle over meaning. So I think you're right. But my question is, I mean, I'm trying to really think, who sits and thinks, I mean, who censors these things? I mean, do people really, at least here in the US, do they come and sit and say, okay, we want to censor this? And even the question is, do they really read what they want to censor, or just based on the title? Or, I mean, I'm not sure if this is a good question, but I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I can tell you, and other people can speak to this too. So I mentioned briefly, like in the opening remarks, there's like an organizing group that kind of, annually puts out a list. I briefly taught as a high school educator in Georgia, and so I suspect most states are similar in the sense that, once that list is kind of generated, right, and sometimes it's not necessarily this definitive list from this organization, sometimes even within a school board or within a state, districts will ban books for all previously mentioned objectionable content for a number of reasons, right? Perceived hypersexuality or sexually explicit material, perceived, queer, LGBTQIA relationships or characters, political, like for a lot of reasons, right? Black Lives Matter, any host of reasons. And so I don't know that superintendents in the districts always have read these books, right? I don't know, in some cases, maybe in most cases they haven't read the books, but in terms of having to be the policy administrator for a district, I do know that they do not want parent backlash in school board meetings. Like, so once once things are, and I don't actually know, maybe these are in people either, especially now, right, social media, maybe they saw a YouTube clip or maybe they heard like this book is about, and sometimes those people haven't read the book at all, right? Or sometimes even in spite of, objections they might have to some of the content, if they were to read it, they might say, wow, this is a really, education, this book has a really good message. I wish my child were exposed to it, but sometimes people can't get past the whatever initial information that they have, received, which sometimes is erroneous information or overblown information. So I think that might be the root of your question. Like, I don't know how they initially get put on a list, but I suspect, strong kind of parental or church objection to particular types of text that make their way to board meetings, and, they're kind of, I think it's a ground up thing, right? That as opposed to in the constitutional monarchy where it's a top-down thing, right? Where if the government suspects or knows that a writer has mentioned or spoke ill of, the ruling, the monarchy or whatever, and then the government suppresses it. I think it's more ground up in the U.S. if I had to say, right? If I had to guess. So I think it's generated internally, and then from all of these smaller lists, there's this master list that's generated, right? But here are the most frequently banned books, of which our esteemed Toni Morrison often finds herself or would have found herself. So yeah, did that answer your question at all?
Yes, thank you.
I think something that's important to note too, specifically for Banned Books Week, is that often these conversations began in the PTA, which is the Parent Teacher Association of public and private schools. And so one thing that's important to remember is who has time to serve on the PTA, and it tends to be people in positions of privilege. And so you will often find that the people who are most active in the PTA for lower education are people who are financially stable, who have leisure time, who have a lot of resources, a lot of just simply physical energy. They don't work all day. They don't have to, go to multiple shifts and multiple things. And so that's not to say that everyone on a PTA is in that situation, but it is by and large a large demographic of who is on the PTA and who typically will raise these concerns to begin with the district. And so I think that's when we do get back to the idea of, is censorship political inherently? Because most of the time, that then kind of reinforces our assumption at the beginning that it is always directly related to power. And it's really hard for power to ever be apolitical, because to be powerful means that someone else is less powerful. And so I think that that's something to note too for those who may not be familiar how that works in the US. And so ultimately, PTA makes complaints to school boards make decisions, and then state level decisions actually get made, and so on and so forth. And so I think that's where I'm coming from as far as an educator, and even in public universities, you know? So for private ones, okay, people make decisions about their schools, sure. But when it's a public university, I think, or a public school, I think that that's where you really see the politics come in a lot.
All right, thank you for that very insightful observation in response to our question. And I do want to acknowledge a question or comment from the audience.
I read that they wanted to ban Harry Potter, which of course inspired me to read the book.
Good for you.
That's good.
I think it must have been evangelicals who just hated the idea of witchcraft. But especially the later books, you saw kids with 600-page books and they were reading. And I say, you know.
That's the spirit.
However, so far as I know, none of the schools banned the books, and certainly the library didn't remove the books from the shelves.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any of the districts that I'm familiar with having banned them. But yeah, there was a strong parental backlash, and this will speak to an earlier question. I can remember my mother saying something in passing, and she's not evangelical, but she's older, so she's conservative, and she hadn't read the books. They're fanciful, I think easy for a child to become enamored with those books, right? As an adult, I stood in line several hours for the release of a couple of those books. So not just kids, right? But completely innocuous, most people would think if they read it. But what she heard or what she thought, was that, it's about, and it's about which, and so in some cases the reputation overshadows the reality. I don't think, anyone who reads that would think, what? It just seems to be fairly innocuous fantasy, although, yeah, so to your point, it's hard to see, once you actually read it, kind of what's the objection, I think that's the case probably with a lot of texts that end up on those lists, yeah.
Although I think that in the case of Harry Potter, kids have power. And having been a kid, I know that this is a really appealing idea. So, and people get touchy about that.
Yeah.
Some parents get real touchy about anything that might take power away from the parents.
Oh, for sure. I'm very much like that with my kids. I should have never encouraged you to read. Yes.
Incidentally, Toni Morrison and Slade Morrison have written a number of picture books. They're down in our kids' library.
Oh, awesome. That's great.
And I thought, wow, Nobel Prize winner in our kids' picture books.
Wow. I love to peruse the kids section and find new books for my daughter, so I'll have to check those out. I did not know that. Awesome.
A great point that I think Samara had that quote, and it's the aftermath of the censorship, at least in maybe country in terms of books. It has the opposite effect. You bring attention, people start talking about it. That can sometimes create, in the long term, a movement towards ending that censorship. So it's the way that kind of power plays out over time. Not to say that censorship is good, but there usually is, if there's a popular book, that's right, especially among children, which is sometimes what these parents their argument is for the children. And so when that kind of, goes off in the smoke, it doesn't work anymore, that collective can, build to, give it more attention than maybe it would have gotten without any sort of, controversy.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we haven't touched on, and it may require its own separate event, right? But that, back to one of Leah Beth's remarks in the beginning, is that, the potential for, mostly during Banned Books Week, we're talking about K through 12, right? But when we see, legislators trying to, suppress or stifle the teaching of critical race theory, that, the concern for higher ed is real, and it is one that we should all be, mindful of and cognizant of, and kind of on the lookout for. But I don't know that we have time to get into it this evening. But I think I would love to I think it deserves its own separate, probably, conversation. But I think if there are no more questions or comments from the panelists.
I think I have one for Anthony. So I'm not a TikToker, number one. So Kaby Lame, right? Is that how you say it?
Kabilame.
Okay, sorry, because the KH in Arabic becomes
It's okay.
So hasn't the Italian government, changed, its mind about giving him citizenship now, since he became, very famous,
He gave a Google interview over summer, and he still is not a citizen. Now, of course, he says it doesn't matter to him because he's Italian, because he's grew up there. I don't think that really has swayed any sort of big movement to change immigration laws in Italy. It would take the coalition to agree on something, and that doesn't happen. Let me just give you some context. Italy's government fails about once every 15 months since the end of World War II, and the monarchy was abolished. And so that political stability doesn't exist. And I think his prowess is also on social media, where I think there is, for better or for worse, it's not necessarily governed internationally. And so he has a chance to kind of shine within Italy, which has a pretty much mostly free internet, and all over the world.
Okay.
So it has not prompted any politicians to form a coalition to get him or people like him citizenship, at least not significant enough to merit a discussion yet.
And I don't think that's surprising, because here in the U.S. we've had many instances of children either, brought over very early or something like that, and they're well established as American citizens in their own minds. There's a great author, I think his name is Jose Vargas, who wrote, I'm trying to remember the title, but the subtitle is Notes of an Undocumented Citizen, and he essentially became famous for being undocumented, and the U.S. government still would not grant him documents. And so, I mean, he was very visibly someone who could be deported, but was not many times, because he was kind of using his own vulnerabilities to make the case that it doesn't matter what you achieve if you have come in the wrong way according to the government. And so, I mean, I don't think we should be very shocked at Italy when it happens here.
Look at our kids.
Exactly.
And some of them have grown up, they've become doctors, teachers, valuable citizens, and we want to throw them out?
To a place that they've never called home.
Yes, exactly.
So another danger of censorship.
Yes, I think.
It's a little somber note to end on.
It is. Well, here's what I would say in terms of why we should continue to read and teach banned books in some cases as educators, is to continue to speak truth to power, as the proverbial expression, right? But to continue to try to resist the need to clearly delineate the powerful and the powerless. So we will continue to teach Morrison and fight the brave fight. I think it's a good note to end on.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so
Thank you very
much.
much.
Y'all have a great evening.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. For setting this up.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey, for this.